At my granddaughter's christening reception, my daughter-in-law picked up the wooden keepsake box I'd spent 3 months carving, turned it over once like she was checking a price sticker, and set it on Dick's table beside the wrapping paper pile. Not with the other presents. With the trash. "It's very rustic," she said, smiling for her friend's camera. "We're going more of a modern nursery vibe." The room did that careful laugh. I didn't say a word. I walked over, picked up my box, tucked it under my arm, and said I had an early drive home. That night, my son called, and I could hear from his first breath that something had broken in him. "Mom," he said. "Mom, please tell me you still have the box." I sat down at my kitchen table in Sudbury with the box in front of me and my late husband's handwriting on the folded paper inside it, and I said very gently, "Why do you ask, sweetheart? My name is Irene Gallagher. I'm 64 years old, and for 31 years, I ran a small woodworking shop on Regent Street where I built furniture people actually kept. Not the flat-pack kind that splinters after 2 moves. The real kind, with dovetail joints and hand-sanded edges and the smell of cedar that gets into your clothes and stays. I've built cradles and kitchen tables, and hope chests, and once, a coffin for a man who asked me to while he still could. My hands are calloused in specific places that tell the whole story of what I do. The base of my right thumb. The inside of my left index finger. The kind of marks a machine doesn't make on you. My husband Harold passed 22 months before that christening. 41 years of marriage, and then a November morning, and then a house on Elm that was suddenly too large for one person. Harold was a quiet man, in the way that only very certain people are quiet. He never raised his voice because he never needed to. He coached youth hockey for 18 years in this town, and never once yelled at a child, and he won more than he lost, which I always thought said everything. He drove a truck with a cracked dashboard he refused to replace because it didn't affect the driving. He wore the same canvas jacket every autumn until I finally retired it while he slept. He was not sentimental about things, Harold. He was sentimental about people, which is different and rarer. What I didn't understand until near the very end was how long he'd been preparing for someone who hadn't arrived yet. About 2 weeks before Harold died, when we both knew, he asked me to bring him the metal cash box from the bottom of his workshop. I'd seen that box for decades. I'd assumed it held old receipts, machine warranties, the kind of paper a man accumulates and can't quite throw away. It held Canadian savings bonds, bound in elastic bands by year, going back further than I expected. He'd been buying them since our son was 12 years old, a little at a time, the way he did everything. $50 here when he had a good month. $100 at Christmas instead of buying something for himself. The envelope taped to the inside of the lid was in his handwriting. For the first grandchild. Started. The year Brendan turned 12, Harold told me, his voice thin but his eyes still very Harold, that he'd figured a grandchild would come eventually. He wanted to give that child a head start nobody could argue with or spend in a weekend. He squeezed my hand. "They've all come due now, Irene. They're worth real money." I asked him how much. He told me. I'll tell you now the way I had to tell my son later, in full, without softening it. Just over $42,000. 4 decades of patience and small decisions, and Harold saying, no thank you to boats and golf memberships, and the new television our son kept suggesting. $42,000 saved for a child who didn't have a name yet. Then Harold told me the part that mattered more than the number. "Don't just hand them a check," he said. "A check they'll use for something they'll forget." He thought for a moment. "Put it in the box. The small cedar one, the one you made for my mother. Sand it new and put the bonds inside and put something else in there with them. A letter. Write it down for me, Irene. I'll tell you what to say." So I did. I sat beside his bed with a notepad, and I wrote down what Harold Gallagher, who had coached 100 children and fixed every broken thing in every house on our street, and never once asked for anything, wanted to say to a grandchild he was not going to meet. He made me read it back twice. He corrected 2 sentences, then he signed it in the shaky hand that the last months had given him. He said, "Seal it up and put it with the bonds. Tell them to open the letter at 18. And Irene." He looked at me very directly. "Make it a surprise." Don't hand them an envelope at the hospital. Put it in something. Make them find it. Make it mean something, not just money in a box. Make them find it. That was nearly the last clear thing Harold ever asked of me, and I had every intention of honoring it exactly. So I made a new box, not the cedar one from his mother. A new one, from a piece of black walnut I'd had in the shop for years, waiting for the right purpose. I worked on it in the evenings after supper, which is when the workshop is quietest and the grief is loudest, so the two kept each other company. I carved a small pattern into the lid, interlocking rings, the kind people put on wedding things, because this felt like a kind of promise. On the inside base, I fitted a false bottom, shallow but solid, the kind you'd only find if you were looking, or if someone showed you where to press. I pressed Harold's bonds flat and folded his letter into its envelope. To be opened at 18, with all my love, Grandpa Harold, and I laid them in the hidden tray and fitted the false bottom over them and sanded everything smooth. From the outside, it was a beautiful box. A real one, built by hand, the kind that would outlast everyone in that room. From the outside, it was also just a box. Nothing about it announced itself. And I suppose that was the point. My daughter-in-law. I want to be honest about her, the way I tried to be honest as Detton, in a story I heard once that reminded me of my own. I don't want her to be a villain in a cartoon. She's more complicated than that, and the more is the part that still makes me sad. Her name is Sienna. She's 31, and she grew up in North Toronto in a house where her mother kept a running account of what everything cost. Not cruelly, I don't think, just as a language. The cost of things was how her mother talked about their value, and Sienna learned the language young and learned it fluently. When she met my son Brendan, she was working in brand strategy at a firm downtown, which is work I don't fully understand, but which seemed to involve deciding how things should look before deciding what they were. She was sharp and organized and very beautiful in the way that requires a great deal of invisible effort, and Brendan fell hard and fast the way he's always done everything. She was not unkind to me in the beginning. She was pleasant. She asked polite questions about woodworking and listened to the answers for exactly as long as was necessary. She looked at my house on Elm with the expression of someone trying to be respectful of a place they would never choose to live. I didn't take it personally. I'd raised a son who loved her, and that was enough for me, or close enough. After the baby came, they named her Rowan, a name Sienna had apparently researched for months, and which I love, for what it's worth. The pleasant politeness stretched thinner. Sienna's Instagram had 100,000 followers by then, and the baby had become part of the content in the way that seemed normal to people under 40, and faintly heartbreaking to me. A curated nursery in sage and linen, a stroller that cost more than my first used car. Everything photographed from above, all the edges soft, everything matching. My son smiling in the frame like a prop who'd wandered in and decided to stay. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my life to design, but I noticed. The christening was in February, which is February in Sudbury, which means gray and cold, and the kind of light that makes everything look like an old photograph. The reception was at Sienna's mother's house in the Glebe, because they'd driven down to Ottawa for the weekend. Her mother's house is the kind that's been renovated so many times it no longer remembers what it originally was. Everything is white and deliberate, and there are no books visible anywhere, which tells you something. I drove down with the box on the passenger seat, where Harold used to sit. I talked to him a little on the way I've started doing. "Big day," I said. "We're finally giving Rowan the gift." "Can you believe it, Harold? We're grandparents after all. I had no idea I was about to watch our granddaughter's mother place our granddaughter's inheritance with the torn tissue paper. The reception was done up beautifully. I'll give her that. White flowers I couldn't name, soft music, little sandwiches nobody ate. There was a backdrop with Rowan's name in gold script. Her mother's friend was moving through the room with a camera that looked professional, and I understood after a few minutes that everything happening was also content. A story being built in real time for an audience I'd never meet. I found a chair near the window, and I held my box in my lap, and I felt, under everything, a small and steady warmth. I had a secret the way you have a secret when you're about to give someone something they don't know they need. Every time Sienna's mother glanced at my plain brown paper wrapping with that careful pity, I just thought about the false bottom and the folded bonds and the envelope in Harold's handwriting, and I was fine. My old friend Janet found me, Harold's closest friend's wife, who'd known us since the children were small. She sat beside me and squeezed my arm. "Is that the famous box?" she said quietly. "Harold told Ray everything about it, you know. The bonds, the letter, all of it. That man." She shook her head fondly. He never stopped planning ahead. I smiled. "Frank's orders," I almost said, then caught myself. "Harold's orders. Make them find it. Make it a surprise." "You should say something before she opens it," Janet murmured. "Tell her there's something inside so she's careful." I shook my head. He was very specific. "Let her find it herself. I'll point her to the base once she has it in her hands." Janet chuckled. "He always did like to let things unfold at their own pace, your Harold." I think about that conversation now. If I'd listened. If I'd stood up and told the room before Sienna's hands ever touched it that there was $42,000 and a dead man's last letter built into the base of that box, she would have handled it like it was made of glass. There would have been no story. But I didn't, because a dying man had asked me not to, and because I had spent 64 years on this earth and never once imagined that a person would publicly set a handmade gift in the rubbish pile. That particular failure of imagination cost me a great deal that afternoon. The gift opening was the center of the event, organized the way Sienna organizes everything, with an eye for what photographs well. She sat in the good chair under the gold script backdrop, her mother beside her narrating for the camera, her friend moving to get the best angle. Each gift lifted, shown, named. A cashmere sleep sack, an organic swaddle set from a shop in Kensington Market, a silver rattle with the baby's name engraved. Each one met with exactly the right response, a studied delight that I suspected had been practiced. I watched my son across the room. Brendan was standing near the kitchen doorway with a coffee he kept forgetting to drink, smiling the smile of a man performing a version of himself. He caught my eye once and lifted one shoulder slightly, a small helpless thing, and I should have read that better than I did. It was the gesture of a man who knew something uncomfortable was coming and had already decided to let it pass. Then there were two gifts left. An envelope and my box in its brown paper. Sienna's mother picked up my box and read the tag. "From Grandma Irene," she said, in the bright, careful voice adults use for children's artwork. Sienna took it. She assessed the wrapping the way she assesses everything, quickly and in terms of what it signals. The corner of her mouth shifted just slightly. Something decided. She pulled off the paper, and there it was. 3 months of my evenings. The black walnut dark and warm, the interlocking rings carved into the lid, the hand-sanded edges that catch the light differently depending on the angle. A piece of wood that had been in my shop for years waiting. In that bright staged room full of things in boxes from stores, it looked to my eyes like the only object that had been made by a specific person for a specific purpose. Sienna held it up. "Oh," she said. "Did you make this?" "I did," I said. And I started to lean forward, started to say, "There's something special about the base. If you press here, you'll find." But Sienna was already talking to the camera, to the room, with the smooth pivot of someone who's been managing audiences since her 20s. "That's so sweet," she said, "very handcrafted." She set it down beside her on the floor, not on the gift table, and turned to the envelope. Her mother made a small noise of agreement. "Artisanal," she said, and somehow made it sound like a condition to be treated. I felt the room rearrange itself around me, the small, polite reduction. The word handcrafted landing the way homemade lands in certain mouths, a synonym for lesser, for effort applied, where money should have been. And I still thought, it's all right. She'll find the base. I'll catch her after. I'll say, "Sienna, feel along the inside bottom." What I did not anticipate was what happened next. Sienna opened the card from the envelope, oohed at the amount on the gift card from a store I didn't recognize, held it up, photographed beautifully. Then she looked around at the staged, careful room, and she did the social arithmetic that people who live for rooms like this are always doing, and she made a calculation. She reached down and picked up my box. She held it out toward her friend's camera. "It's sweet," she said, "but honestly, we're doing a very clean aesthetic for Rowan's nursery." She looked toward the corner where the hostess had placed a large wicker basket for wrapping paper and discarded packaging. She crossed to it, still half smiling for the camera, and she placed my box on top of the crumpled tissue paper. Very carefully, the way you set something down when you want it to look like a decision rather than a discard. "Very handcrafted things have their place," she said. "I just want to keep our space intentional." And she turned back to the room and the camera, and the rest of the afternoon, the room carried on. A few people laughed softly. Her mother nodded. Brendan, my son, who had his father's fishing hat on a hook in his apartment hallway, who had called me sobbing the night Harold died, who kept a photo of his dad on his nightstand. Brendan stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the basket and looked at his shoes and said absolutely nothing. That was the moment that cost me the most. Not the basket, not Sienna's smile, my son's shoes. I have heard unkind things in 64 years. I have been called old-fashioned, behind the times, a woman who works with her hands in an age when that's quaint. None of it ever landed the way that wicker basket did. Because inside that basket, under the crumpled tissue paper of other people's afternoons, was the last thing Harold Gallagher ever made with whatever he had left to give. $42,000 and a letter to a girl he never got to hold. Here's what I want you to understand about the next 60 seconds, because it is the hinge of everything that followed. I had a choice. I could have stood up and said, in front of everyone and the camera, what that box contained. I could have let the number do the talking. I could have watched Sienna's face change and let the room witness the change and felt, I won't pretend otherwise, some satisfaction in it. Part of me wanted that. The part that had driven 4 hours and built something with arthritic hands and talked to my dead husband on the highway about being grandparents after all. But I didn't, because the bonds in the letter were safe, sealed in the false bottom, and Sienna hadn't found them and wasn't going to. Because a camera was running, and the camera belonged to Sienna's friend, and everything in that room was being preserved in a way that would matter later. And because the worst possible response to a woman who performs for an audience is to give her a better performance to be part of. The truth was safer in my pocket until I could deliver it somewhere that couldn't be turned into content. So I stood up quietly. I crossed to the basket. I picked up my box. I brushed off a piece of curled ribbon that had settled on the lid. "Oh," said Sienna from across the room. "Did you want it back?" "Of course. Take it." "It's all right," I said. My voice was very steady. I simply thought I'd look after it for now. The steadiness bothered her. I could see it. She'd expected embarrassment. What she got was a 64-year-old woman in sensible shoes tucking a walnut box under her arm with the same calm she'd used to carry in groceries, and walking to collect her coat. I thanked her mother for a lovely afternoon. I kissed Rowan's head. I said goodbye to Janet. I found Brendan in the kitchen doorway, and I squeezed his arm and I looked at him for a moment without saying anything, and then I put on my coat and I walked out. I made it to the car before I let myself feel it. I sat in the cold with the box on my lap and Harold's bond sealed safe inside it, and I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and I let the afternoon happen to me all at once. The ribbon on the tissue paper, the word handcrafted, the basket, Brendan's shoes. "I'm sorry, Harold," I whispered. I should have said something before she touched it. I should have protected it better. But grief, when you let it come, has a way of running clean. By the time my tears stopped, I knew with a certainty that was perfectly calm what I was going to do. Not because I was angry. Because Harold had said, make it mean something, and the only way it was going to mean something now was if I did it properly, in a room where it couldn't be photographed and positioned and posted and explained away. The phone was ringing before I was out of the parking lot. It was Janet. Irene. Her voice was tight. "I'm sorry. I should have said something in there. I should have stood up." "You and Brendan both," I said. "It's fine, Janet. I have the box. She never found the base. She doesn't know." "Oh." Janet was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know about the bonds. The letter." "She set down a handmade box," I said. "That's all she thinks she did." There was a pause. Irene, I have to tell you something. After you left, I was standing near Brendan and I wasn't thinking. I said something. I said Harold would be heartbroken, all those bonds finally going to Rowan in that box, just like he planned. Irene, I didn't mean to, the look on his face. I closed my eyes. I told him what was inside it, Janet said. What his wife put in the basket. He went gray, Irene. He left. He didn't say anything to Sienna, he just left. I thanked her. I hung up. And I sat in the February cold of a parking lot in Ottawa, and I understood that somewhere in this city, my son was driving with that knowledge detonating inside him. That Harold's bonds and Harold's letter had been in the basket, that Brendan had stood in the doorway and chosen his shoes. I started the car and drove to Janet's hotel because I needed somewhere to sit that wasn't the car, and because I'd promised Harold I'd bring the box home safe, and I intended to. He called 20 minutes later. Before I tell you what he said, let me tell you what those 20 minutes had been for me, because it matters. I'd sat in Janet's room with the box on the table, and I'd opened the false bottom with the small hidden press Harold had shown me, just to check. The bonds were exactly as I'd folded them. Elastic banded by year, $42,000 of Harold, saying yes to patience and no to everything else, and the envelope in his careful printing. To Rowan. To be opened at 18. All my love, Grandpa Harold. I held that envelope and I thought about the hospital room. About Harold correcting 2 sentences. About him saying, read it back to me once more. Irene, and meaning it. He had wanted that letter to be read by a young woman who would never have met him. He had wanted her to know, 20 years from the day he sent it, that she had been wanted before she existed, planned for before she was possible. And a 31-year-old woman in a linen blazer had set it in a wicker basket because it didn't suit the aesthetic. Make them find it, Harold had said. Make it last. She hadn't even opened the box. The phone rang. It was Brendan, and his voice was already in pieces before he said a word. Mum. Just the one syllable. Mum, please, tell me you took the box. I have it, I said. Right here in front of me. The bonds are safe. She never found the base. The sound he made was not quite a word, long and shaking and surfacing from somewhere deep. Oh, thank God, he said. Oh, Mum. He'd been sitting in his car in the parking garage of Sienna's mother's building, he told me later, doing the mathematics of what he'd allowed. He'd watched the box go into the basket, and he'd told himself it was just a thing. It was a misunderstanding. He'd explain it to me later. He'd make it right. The old reflex. Don't make a scene. Keep the day smooth. Then Janet had said $42,000. Harold's last letter, the box, just like he planned. And Brendan had looked at the basket where it no longer was, because I'd taken it, and for one terrible minute he'd thought it was gone, that Sienna's friend had already bagged up the wrapping paper, that Harold's 4 decades of saving had gone to a recycling bin in Ottawa. He hadn't confronted Sienna. He'd just walked out. Mom, what was inside it? His voice was steady now, in the way of someone holding themselves together by concentration. Janet said bonds. She said a letter. Tell me exactly. Your father's Canada Savings bonds, I said. All of them. Every one he bought from the time you were 12 years old. A little at a time. Every good month. Every birthday he didn't buy himself something. They came due this year. They're worth $42,000. I let that sit for a moment. And his letter, I said. The one he dictated to me in the hospital, for Rowan to open when she's 18, so that a young woman who never got to meet her grandfather can sit down someday and hear from him anyway. In his own words. The line went quiet, and then my son made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy, raw and helpless and young in a way that a grown man almost never sounds. I was right there, he said. I was standing right there, and I didn't say a word. I watched her put it in the basket, and I let it happen. I just let it happen. I let him cry. That's the whole job sometimes. I told myself it was just a thing, he said when he could speak again. That's exactly what I said to myself. Don't make it a scene. It's just a box. And it was Dad, Mum. It was everything, Dad. I know, I said. How are you this calm? Because I have it, I said. And because your father's gift is going to reach your daughter every cent of it, and every word of that letter. Nothing precious was actually lost today. Only some things that needed to be understood, and they're going to be understood now. What do you want me to do? He asked. Tell me and I'll do it. I want everyone in one room, I said. You, Sienna, your Aunt Carol if she'll drive. And I want to give Rowan her grandfather's gift properly, out loud, with everyone there to see what it is and what nearly happened to it. Harold said make them find it. So we're going to find it together, just a little later than he planned. Brendan told Sienna that night. He had to. He said he couldn't sit across the kitchen table from her, holding something that size in his chest. I wasn't there. But I heard both versions eventually. Brendan's version. He sat her down and told her about the false bottom and the bonds and the letter, that the box she'd put in the basket had held $42,000 and Harold's last words to their daughter. Sienna's first words, her very first words, were not "oh my God" or "is it gone" or "what have I done." Her first words were, "How was I supposed to know? Why didn't she say something? Who hides money in a box and doesn't tell anyone? That's not normal. That's, if anything, that's kind of on her. That sentence. That's kind of on her. I've turned it over many times since. Not with anger. With something closer to sorrow. Because what it tells you about Sienna is not that she's a bad person. What it tells you is that she has never in her life been in a position where she had to sit with having done something truly wrong without immediately finding the exit. The exit in this case was me. The woman who hadn't labeled her gift clearly enough. Who should have warned her, who set a trap, essentially. She had set a dead man's legacy in a basket, and within 30 seconds had located the angle from which she was the wronged party. Sienna's version of events, which I heard from Brendan later, was that she'd been blindsided and made to feel guilty over what was clearly an honest mistake in communication, and that nobody understood how much pressure she was under with the baby and the event and her following expecting updates. Not once did Sienna say I'm sorry and mean it. I did not let that determination harden me. I let it inform me. There is a difference. The week after I got home from Ottawa, I made some calls. I put on Harold's reading glasses, which I've started wearing because mine were getting scratched, and I sat at the kitchen table with the bonds and my tea, and I called the bank. The man at the bank was patient and thorough. He confirmed the value, $41,800 and change, and walked me through the options. Then I called a woman named Helen Carver who handles these arrangements, and I told her what I needed. I set up an RSPIC for Rowan, a registered education savings plan, locked and administered independently, because in Canada, that's how you make sure money stays where you put it. Harold's bonds, every dollar, went in. The rest would grow. The government would match a portion the way they do for education savings. And when Rowan was old enough, it would be there for her schooling, her start, whatever she needed. It could not be touched by Sienna. It could not be touched by Brendan. It could not be touched by me. It was Rowan's, and only Rowan's, administered by people whose job it was to make sure that's exactly what happened. I won't pretend. It cost me nothing to lock Brendan out as well. It did, but Harold's wish had been for the grandchild, and the cleanest way to honor a wish is to make it impossible to bend. Then I did the other thing. I planned a dinner. At my house in Sudbury, because some advantages are home advantages, and mine smells like sawdust and 40 years of Sunday meals. And at that dinner, I was going to do the one thing Harold had asked. I was going to make them find what was inside the box, just properly, with everyone watching. It took 3 weeks to arrange. Brendan drove up with Sienna and the baby on a Friday evening, and Carol came the next morning, Harold's younger sister, warm and no nonsense in the way only people who grew up in Northern Ontario can be. I'd made a roast because some preparations are practical. You don't do hard things hungry, and I wanted everyone in a body state that was not defensive before I said a word. We ate. We talked about Rowan. Sienna was tired in the way new mothers are, which stripped away some of the performance and left something more like a person. She complimented the roast and seemed surprised to mean it. Then I cleared the plates, and I set the box on the table where the centerpiece had been. Sienna's eyes found it immediately. She'd hoped, I think, that it might quietly disappear. Comfortable things sometimes do, for people who've learned to arrange their surroundings. Instead, here it was, dark walnut and carved rings, in my kitchen under the overhead light. I'd like to give Rowan her gift from her grandfather, I said. Properly this time. the way Harold asked before he died. The table went still. Brendan's jaw set. Carol sat up slightly. Sienna went carefully neutral, the mask she puts on when she's calculating. "Sienna," I said, and I kept my voice warm and unhurried because warmth and patience were the only tools I needed. "You held this box a few weeks ago, and you made a decision about what it was worth. I'd like to show you, and everyone at this table, what you were actually holding." I picked up the small wooden press tool Harold had made for the false bottom. "These," I said, laying down the elastic-banded stack, "are Canada savings bonds. Harold bought them a little at a time for almost 30 years. He started the year Brendan was 12. He saved them for his first grandchild. They came due this year." I smoothed the stack on the table. "They're worth $41,800. The number moved around the table like a cold window opened in February. Carol pressed her lips together. Brendan closed his eyes briefly. Sienna went the color of the white walls. "And this," I said, and I set down the envelope the way you'd set down something sleeping, "is the last letter Harold ever wrote. He dictated it to me in the hospital. It's for Rowan, to be opened on her 18th birthday, so that a young woman who will have grown up with only a photograph of her grandfather can sit down and hear from him in his own words." I touched the envelope. Harold's exact instruction to me was make it a surprise. Let her find it, make it last. He was specific about that. He thought, if we hid it in something handmade, in something given with real intention, it would be treated with the same intention. I looked at Sienna. I kept my voice as steady and as gentle as I have ever kept it, which I've learned is far more unsettling to some people than anger. "This is what you set in the wastebasket," I said. $41,000 and the last words a grandfather wrote to a grandchild he never met. This is what you called handcrafted. This is what you said didn't fit the aesthetic. Nobody breathed. Sienna reached immediately for the exit. "How was I supposed to know?" she said, her voice climbing just slightly. "No one told me. If there was something valuable inside, someone should have said, 'That's not. You can't put this on me.' This was a communication failure." "No one put anything in a basket without telling you," I said. "You simply made a decision about what something was worth based on how it looked, and you were wrong. The only fault in the communication was that I trusted you to open a gift before deciding to throw it away." Sienna started to say something further, and Brendan said her name. Just her name quietly, but in a voice I had never heard him use. "Don't," he said. "Not one more word of it." Sienna closed her mouth. I let the silence settle. Then I told them what I'd decided. Because I am not a cruel woman, and consequences and mercy have always been able to share a table, which is something I believe Harold and I built together over 41 years. "The money is in an RSEP," I said. "Locked. For Rowan's education and her start in life, administered by people whose job is to make sure it goes nowhere else. Not to Sienna, not to Brendan, not to me. Harold saved it for the grandchild, and the grandchild is who gets it." Brendan nodded. I saw him understand that locking included him, and I saw him accept that without argument, which told me more than any words could. "The letter stays sealed until Rowan is 18, I said. "And the box comes home with me tonight. It'll go to Rowan when I'm certain it's going to a house that knows what it's holding." Sienna started to say something about the box. Brendan said her name again, in the same voice. She stopped. Then I did the last thing. The most important thing. The thing Harold had actually asked for. He wrote a short note for the day the family first learned about the gift, I said. He didn't know what kind of day it would be. But here we are. I took the smaller envelope from my cardigan pocket. I opened it. My hands shook slightly, and I let them, and I read Harold Gallagher's words to his family, at my kitchen table in Sudbury, with his granddaughter asleep in the car seat beside her mother. "If you're hearing this," I read, "then Rowan has arrived, and I'm sorry I missed it. I've been saving for this baby since Brendan was a boy because my own grandfather did the same for me, and it changed what I believed was possible. That's what's in this box. Not just money. The proof that somebody was thinking of you before you were here, before you had a name. That's the thing I want you to have, little one. And whatever you do with it," he wrote, and my voice caught on this part and I let it catch. "Be the kind of person who knows the difference between what something costs and what something is worth. Your grandmother knows. She always has. Learn it from her. All my love, Grandpa Harold. Carol was crying. Brendan had his face pressed to the top of Rowan's head, and Sienna was looking at the box on my kitchen table, and for the first time, I thought she was actually seeing it. Not what it signaled, not what it photographed as, not what category it fit. The actual thing, the rings carved into the lid, the dark warmth of the walnut. 3 months of evenings in a workshop by a woman whose hands don't always cooperate anymore. It was not forgiveness what crossed her face, but it might have been the first moment she understood there was something to forgive. I folded Harold's letter back into its envelope. I didn't do this to humiliate you, Sienna, I said. I know it feels that way. I did it because Rowan is going to grow up in your house, learning how to see the world from you. And someday, she's going to need to understand that there's another way to measure things. The rest's peep is for her future. The letter is for her heart. And the box, I rested my hand on the walnut lid, is to remind everyone in this family, including me, that the most precious thing in a room is almost never the most expensive one. I looked at my son. You stood in that doorway, I said, and you chose easier, the way you've been choosing it for years. I'm not here to shame you, Brendan, but I need you to hear me. The box survived because I refused to be quiet about what it was worth, even when being quiet would have been so much more comfortable. That's the real inheritance, not the bonds. He nodded. He couldn't speak. I'm Rowan's grandmother, I said to the whole table. I'm not optional. I'm not a rustic detail you work around for the aesthetic. I built things people keep. I'll be in this family fully, or we'll need to have a much harder conversation than this one. Nobody argued. Here is how things stand now, because I know that's what you're wondering. The burlesque is growing. $41,000 sitting quietly, doing exactly what Harold intended, collecting the Canada Education Savings Grant on top of it, the way the program is designed to do. Rowan can't touch it until she's ready, and neither can anyone else. Harold thought in decades. Now so does his granddaughter's future. Sienna has never given me a real apology. She's not built for it, at least not yet. But she asked me, 2 months after that dinner, in a small and careful voice, if I would show her how to use a hand plane. I said yes. We've made a small, uneven picture frame together for Rowan's room. Sienna measured 3 times and still got it slightly off, and she laughed at herself for the first time in my presence. She kept the frame. It's on the wall. It's a start. Brendan is the one who changed the most. Shame and grief, when they arrive together, have a way of doing what comfort never managed. He came to me alone, about 6 weeks after the dinner, and sat at the kitchen table where the box had been. Mum, he said, I've been sitting with this. And I keep coming back to the same place. I didn't fail Dad that afternoon at the christening. I'd been failing him for years. Every time I said nothing to keep things smooth. The basket was just the first one I couldn't look away from. That's a hard thing to know about yourself, I said. You tried to tell me, he said. Some things a person has to find for themselves, I told him. I could have said it 1,000 times. It took a walnut box and a basket to make it real. He's different now. He and Sienna are seeing someone, a counselor in their neighborhood, which I never thought I'd see him agree to. He keeps Harold's photo in the front hall, and he's promised Rowan he'll take her fishing at the lake near Halliburton when she's old enough. The lake Harold used to take him to when he was small. I'm still choosing easier, he told me last month. But I'm catching myself now. That's new. It is. The box lives on my mantle, for now. When I'm certain of the house it's going into, it'll go. Sienna has looked at it differently since the dinner. Last visit, she ran her finger along the carved rings on the lid and said quietly, How long did that take you? 4 evenings, I said. Give or take. She nodded. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't look away. My hands are some mornings difficult to argue with. The cold gets into the joints now in a way it didn't used to. But I'm making Rowan a small stool for when she's old enough to sit at a table, low and solid, with her initials routed into the underside, where she'll find them when she's older, and curious enough to look. Because that's what we do, the ones who make things with their hands. We build ourselves into objects quietly, and we wait for the right person to look closely enough to notice. Harold taught me that. He did it with money and patience and a cigar box on the top shelf of his workshop. Time rewards the people who think in decades. If there's one thing I'd give you from all of this, it's this. The world is going to keep telling you that worth is something you can read at a glance, that the expensive gift is the real one. That handmade means lesser. That rustic is a polite word for not good enough. Don't believe it. The most valuable things are almost always the quiet ones, built by hand, given without a logo, easy to overlook if no one ever taught you how to look. Learn how to look, and whatever you love, build it into something that lasts. That's my story. One walnut box, one wicker basket, and a love that 41 years of saving couldn't make ordinary. If it reminded you of something made for you that you still keep, go find it tonight. And if you're watching from anywhere in this country and you know what I mean, drop a comment. I read every one. Subscribe if you want to hear what comes next, and I'll see you soon.